Yeah, that's on. All right. Hi, I'm Mahmoud. How you doing, guys? I'm a musician and producer from Switzerland, and today I want to talk to you about amps, their EQ, and how they work. This will be a crash course lesson on amps for people that are struggling with how to use and how to dial in their amps. Just as a quick aside, guys, I will not be demonstrating exactly how to dial in an amp tone in general. I have done videos on this. However, I will be explaining how an EQ works within most amps, usual amps. I will not be going over active EQs or anything like that. This is just your usual normal amp, be it a Marshall, a 5150, something along those lines. This will explain how the EQ within that works. Hope that helps. So, let's start with the structure of an amp. This is the nerdy technical part of this video, so bear with me. I promise to keep this as short as I can, but this is important knowledge, so just stick around for a second. In an amp, we have the input stage, which is where you plug in your guitar, the preamp, the power amp, and then the speaker. A lot of modern amps have a loop send and return between the pre and the power amp, and most of the EQ knobs on any given amp control parameters that are in the preamp. There's some notable exceptions. Those knobs are usually labeled as presence or depth, depending on the amp that you have. Those often happen in the power amp section as opposed to the preamp section. Now, the vast majority of amps have what we call passive EQs. Also, most modern amp designs tend to have the EQ after the clipping stage, meaning the EQ is not going to affect the character of the distortion itself very much. Amps like some Fender and Mesa Boogie designs have the EQ before the clipping stage, and that influences the distortion character immensely, which is why for some people amps like a Mesa, like a dual rectifier or a Mark series can be notoriously hard to dial in. If you've ever boosted the bass frequencies of your guitar before going into a distortion pedal or a distorted amp, it starts sounding like a fuzz very quickly, even though all you did is change the EQ before distorting. Let me demonstrate this for you really quickly. Let's play this riff, and I'm gonna use this EQ here to first keep it neutral. I'm gonna boost the low end and then cut it, and it will change the characteristic of the distortion a lot. It'll be very extreme. Let me see where the distortion is here. Let me dial that up just for emphasis, and let's listen to that. As you can tell, a lot of low end going into the distortion creates what we perceive as a very fuzzy, undefined, unrefined, and like a lot less attack on the sound. However, if we go the other way, it tends to sound lo-fi. So just be mindful of that. There's no right or wrong here, just this is what happens when you EQ before the distortion. If you've ever seen a Mesa Boogie Mark series amp with those EQs on the right side, that's an active parametric EQ, as we've already shown. Active EQs are usually more expensive and need more components to make. They are often harder to dial in for the end users, aka us guitarists. What does it mean to have a passive EQ? Before we answer that, if this video taught you something new already, please leave a like and subscribe. It's free and it helps me a lot. Back to the passive EQ question. What does it mean to have a passive EQ? It means you are only cutting frequencies. You're not adding to the signal, you're only taking away. What does that look like? Let's open up an amp sim and an EQ next to it as a visual aid. Let's say we have, I'm gonna run this riff here. The midpoint here, let's say we put this at a 5. 5. The midpoint is what we would call technically like -5, because we're not adding anything to the signal. But if 10 is the max, then 5 is cutting half of what we can with that specific knob. Make any sense? So let's look at the bass knob. The bass knob is usually a low cut, high pass filter, whatever you want to call it. Turning the bass knob on the amp all the way up, like you're cranking that bass knob, would translate to basically backing off that filter as much as you can. What does that mean? You aren't adding any bass. You're just cutting the bass that your amp is naturally producing. For example, if I take this down to 0, I might be cutting somewhere here. But turning it all the way up doesn't add any bass, it's just letting the naturally produced low end through. Where this cutoff is set and how much you can take away, that is going to differ a lot from amp to amp. What about the mid control? Cranking the mids on the amp would look something like this. It's just not cutting that much low end, maybe somewhere around 500-ish. Let's play that real quick. I'm gonna turn down the bass and treble so we isolate the mids as much as we can. As you can hear, the mid's center frequency shifts as I turn it up and turn it back down. So basically, the mid control, it might start somewhere here, and maybe it's rather flat in the beginning, and then the more you turn it down, it might shift upwards and get more narrow. Usually, the mid control is a bell curve as opposed to the high pass of the low end. Where these frequencies are set and how much you're cutting, again, depends on the amp. Let's look at the treble knob. A 0 might translate to something like you cutting the signal, something like that. Let's play around with that. The control, more often than not, is a high shelf, meaning the frequency where it starts at usually stays the same, but you're lifting up everything that comes above it. At a 10, this knob here might be somewhere around here and just letting through all of the naturally produced high end of the amp. Relatively speaking, this is on the higher end when it comes to guitar tones, as you're boosting everything from there and up. In absolute terms though, amps and speakers tend to roll off quite a bit after 6K and even more drastically after 8K. Which means if you look at an absolute curve of an amp, let's take a look at that actually. See here, we're at like 5K-ish, 6K, and it starts dropping rapidly. Above that, there's almost no useful information for distorted amplifiers. In context of the other instruments, that's only where the higher end of a mix begins. Most humans are capable of hearing up to around 16 to 20K. So even if you're on the lower end of hearing capabilities, you will still probably hear the whole range of the guitar. Now that you know that, what I like to do is to find out what I like on an amp EQ-wise. I tend to grab an EQ knob while playing and crank it all the way as I've just shown you, and listen out for things that I enjoy. I bring it back then until I am happy with how that frequency range is behaving. The same method obviously works on all of the knobs on an amp, Just be careful with the volume, of course. Set it at a moderate volume that you can listen to and you'll be fine. Other than that, go ham. Explore your amps with these ideas and have fun. Now, as a quick demonstration, I want to show you something that I built a quick chain within Cubase. I have this regular amp thing going on here, and as a comparison, I wanted to show you this weird chain. Basically, it's a DI signal, and I have Helix Native running with only an overdrive pedal, just to boost the signal before what will be the amp. The amp is just Saturn, and here's how that sounds. This is to show you how an amp EQ works if it was kind of stylized this way and not twisty knobs on an old school head. And after that, we have this EQ that I've been playing around with already. And at the very end, we have a Zilla cab, just so we have an IR. Let's listen to how this not an amp sounds. Sounds fairly close to an actual amp, doesn't it? It might not be the best sound. It might not be even usable. I don't know. I could probably make it usable. But let's play around with the EQ, as we've already talked about. I'm gonna leave that around there. This is pretty simple to dial in. I know it sounds not quite right, but for demonstration purposes, I think it's quite nice to see that the simple contraption within an analog amp basically translates to that. And if you keep that in mind, I hope that helps you dialing in your amp, be it a real amp or a plugin or on a Helix or an amp sim of your choice. I hope this helps you. I've been Mahmoud. Thanks so much for watching. If this video actually helped you, please leave a like and subscribe and give me your thoughts in the comments. Take care, my friends, and I will see you next time. Cheers.